Hello. I think we are amazingly fortunate here at the Millis Institute for being able to spend a good 9 hours on Karl Popper's The Logic of Scientific Discovery uh, in our philosophy and science course. And not only 9 hours, but 9 hours of Socratic style lectures. Uh, I think there are very few universities in the world at the moment that are looking at this text, which is probably the most, or probably definitely the most important text in the philosophy of science in the 20th century. Um, Although Popper is generally covered and his scientific thought is covered in almost every university, every science student becomes familiar with his work on falsification. Generally, we don't look at Popper's thought works or writings directly in a university context. They're considered to be too complex. The book is too thick. It's too difficult for first year students to look at. It's too difficult for third year students to look at. Maybe postgrads can look at it. So generally, Popper's condensed into a few sentences here or there, maybe a few handouts, maybe a few secondary sources, and students get a view of Popper through that. So what we're doing is radically different. I think, I mean, it's not something that you'll find in any university in the Western world or anywhere to have time allocated 3 hours per week for 3 weeks to combing through sentence by sentence and having a close reading of passages in Popper's Logic of Scientific Discovery, and seeing that often what Popper said is often very different to how people construe Popper. That when you have a close reading, all sorts of amazing things pop up that the leading experts and scholars even uh, overlook or don't pay attention to. So, in that sense, it was a risk putting Popper right at the beginning of a course for first year students. But I think everyone has done outstandingly well. Even those students who haven't read philosophy of science before, I think everyone is doing an uh, amazing job. In terms of summarising uh, what we covered in the last lecture, um, if we turn to page 15, the top of page 15, we can see what Popper's project was basically. He said, "My criterion of demarcation will accordingly have to be regarded as a proposal for an agreement or convention." So, first of all, this book aims at providing a new convention for interpreting or describing scientific method. It's not actually trying to be scientific. It's proposing a convention, a normative standard, as it were. And the reason for this is because he believes that the philosophy of science existing at that time, particularly in Vienna and the Vienna Circle, uh, the positivism, while attempting to eradicate metaphysics from empirical science, uh, led to the invasion of metaphysics into the scientific realm. So, by trying to get rid of metaphysics, the logical positivists and positivistic views of science basically became metaphysical without realizing it. So that's Popper's argument. So he wants to have a more nuanced or more sophisticated understanding of the role of metaphysics and science. Part of that involves, okay, what is science for Popper? Traditionally, there's the concept that the logical positivists held was the concept of science as an empirical science, and therefore a division was needed between a science and metaphysical ideas. However, Popper radically views science not as an empirical system, but as an empirical theoretical system. Yeah. So, and that's a crucial point, that it's not just an empirical system, but it's also a theoretical system. Uh, so let's uh, unpack this a little bit more to get a sense of what Popper means here. Um, if we look at the top of page 16, which we combed through in class, uh, let me just read this out to give some. I think this is page 16 of Logic of Scientific Discovery. I think this is one of the most underappreciated quotes in Popper's work, and probably one of the most important quotes, I think, almost, or passages in the philosophy of science in the 20th century. So Popper starts with, I do not even go so far as to assert that metaphysics has no value for empirical science, for it cannot be denied that along with metaphysical ideas which have which have obstructed the advance of science, there have been others, such as speculative atomism, which have aided it. And looking at the matter from the psychological angle, I am inclined to think that scientific discovery is impossible without faith in ideas which are often of a purely speculative kind, and sometimes even quite hazy, a faith which is completely unwarranted from the point of view of science, and which, to that extent, is metaphysical. Um, this is a crucial point. The point of speculative atomism is quite clear. It's the way ancient Greek atomistic philosophy inspired contemporary atomic theory, and that you needed often the highly speculative, uh, empirically untestable theories to be thrown out there, to be this wild speculation to be thrown out there, because at a later date, perhaps uh, uh, testing can be conducted. They can inspire testing, and they may indeed become science. Not all the time, but it is part of the process of discovery. What's crucial about this point is that Popper states that he's taking a psychological angle, um, and that discovery is impossible without faith. And what is this the faith in? It, it it's a faith in a kind of in a in a moral attitude. It's a faith in something that is, well, it's not. Popper doesn't refer exactly to what the faith is in. Later he will say faith and reason, but at this stage he's later in life. But at this stage he's leaving it open. He's saying faith, okay, faith and ideas, but he leaves us quite hazy. Even he says quite hazy, and it's a faith that, from the point of view of traditional point of view of science, is completely unwarranted. So crucially, he sees there is a role of faith, uh, in something that is totally beyond science, and it's he unpacks that a bit more in his later writings. But I think a telling clue here, if we turn over to page 18, we see, okay, what is this faith? This faith in ideas, this faith in reason, this completely unwarranted thing, this faith that is absolutely necessary for scientific discovery. That scientific discovery, according to Popper, the most famous philosopher of science, it is completely incapable without. And we see on page 18 in a notes section down the bottom, Popper starts talking about meaning. And he's talking about drawing a line inside meaningful language. So whereas the logical positivist, sought to distinguish between a, a me- meaningful science and scientific statements and the meaningless uh, uh, collection of meaningless knowledge relating to theology, uh, relating to other forms of literary and artistic creation, relating to other forms of metaphysical speculation concerning God, the soul, immortality, uh, and that kind of that became an obsession for positivism, logical positivism, that creating a demarcation between what is meaningful and what is meaningless. And Popper says, okay, he's not going to play that game. He's going to focus on what is meaningful, and he's going to enlarge the scope of what is meaningful. Because eventually, what happens with the logical positivists, they demarcate between meaningful and meaningless to such an extent that eventually uh, there's in that line becomes completely that position becomes untenable, and the meaningful becomes both meaningless and the meaningless becomes meaningful. So what Popper does is to expand the domain of what we regard as meaningful language and meaningful science. Um, and meaningful thought, more or less, and I think, and just meaning generally, and this is crucial, because in terms of his theory of falsification, what this means is that a statement, a scientific statement, may not be falsifiable, may not be testable, but is nonetheless meaningful. And that is a very crucial point, because for Popper, what is important is coming to interesting knowledge, and as well as saving the particular technical aspects of science. He doesn't want to throw out the whole array of meaningful experience and meaningful knowledge that we have that cannot be tested in a strictly empirical way, that falls outside the domain of science, but that nonetheless is crucial for the project of human rationality. So in that sense, he's increasing the domain of meaningfulness, what is meaningful, and trying to increase the 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 domain or the scope of what we regard as rational or reasonable. And this is an important point here. If we see following Popper that all human knowledge is fallible, and that he gives up the idea of certainty and the idea of certain knowledge, certain demonstrable knowledge, and that all knowledge is fallible. We can see him keeping in a tradition of Francis Bacon here, in an earlier theological tradition, the idea that since the fall of man, since Adam, human knowledge is faulty, and there's kind of an increase having this faith in reason, faith in rationality, this optimism in growing knowledge. There is a kind of redemptive project here, this kind of working towards a return to an idealized but yet never fully attainable state of of, 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 of of the state of Adam, of a state of humans in a closer relationship to God, in a sense. So there is that positive kind of optimism, that faith in reason, that that is crucial. It's not only crucial to science, but crucial to the project of human knowledge and human understanding. that something can be not empirically verifiable, not refutable, but also it can be meaningful. So I think that's an crucial point to make. The other point that we looked at was the idea that there is on page 19 that there is an asymmetry between verifiability and falsifiability, and that's easy to understand following Hume. It's no surprise the idea that I mean it's impossible to have complete certainty in terms of empirical verification. I mean, we have to I mean, even if you've seen a hundred swans, all it takes is one swan to falsify it, to refute the theory. One black swan to refute the theory that all swans are white. So you could, so there is that imbalance. How many swans does it take to verify conclusively that all swans are white? 100, 1,000, a million, a billion. Well, you know, and how many does it take to throw it out? Well, only one. So there is the idea that there is this logical asymmetry or imbalance, and crucially, what I also picked out during my reading in class that hasn't occurred to me before is that asymmetry between verifiability and falsifiability is also reflected in Popper's ethical thought on his negative utilitarianism or harm reduction. That if we liken verifiability to pleasure and falsifiability to harm reduction, we see that there is an asymmetry here. That pain and pleasure do not have a kind of one-to-one correspondence. An example I gave in class was one of the students brought some cake. And we all had a slice of cake. And then I got to thinking, well, what if, how can, and this is Popper's point, can the suffering of an individual, say the suffering of the unbearable suffering of someone in the moment of the most traumatic grief, during a period of war or some other period of suffering, when they are holding the hand of someone that they love who is dying, and that moment where they are absolutely enveloped with grief. How many slices of cake would it take to undo that, or compensate, or equate that, or balance the universe, balance the weight of harm and pleasure in the universe? Well, there is no number. One slice of cake, 10 slices of cake, 100, a million, a billion. No amount of something, some pleasure derived from eating cake, no matter for how many people, can somehow compensate or even come close to the grief or the particular suffering at that particular moment of one individual. Now that I think that's I think there is a analogical connection here, or relationship, between Popper's view on asymmetry between verifiability and falsifiability, and his political decision to prioritize the reduction of harm, or harm reduction, over the searching for pleasure. So, and if we turn over the next page, we see him writing about, on page 20, that the aim of the scientific method, its aim is not to save the lives of untenable systems, but on the contrary to select the one which by comparison the fittest, by exposing them all to the fiercest struggle for survival. Um, this idea of let the ideas die, not people. So I think this is telling here that he's referring to this sort of evolutionary or Darwinism of ideas, of letting ideas fight themselves out, and bad ideas to be thrown out at the theoretical level, rather than say enact bad ideas, say in a form of implementing, communist regimes where you have these economic ideas allowed to play out in a real physical human world and cause suffering. So Popper's ideas here is ideas engage in a Darwinian struggle for survival, in which the aim is to kill the ideas, not the people. And crucially, I think from just reading these few pages at the beginning of Logic of Scientific Discovery, we can see that this text, as well as being a text in scientific method and probably being one of the most technical and sophisticated logical texts in scientific procedures and method that has been written. This is a hard, rigorous logical piece of logical thesis, but at the same time, it's also a metaphysical tract. It's also a theological tract in a way. It's a moral tract. It's a moral work. And it's interesting to note that Popper's title here, The Logic of Scientific Discovery, is in a sense in imitation of Mill's The Logic of the Moral Sciences. So it's no surprising that Popper, as a child, would have looked up at his dad's library and seen the collective works of J.S. Mill, and perhaps read through that as a child or a young man. So there's there are these telling clues, and that lend itself, that give hints. I mean, in a German, the title of the original version, the two fundamental problems of epistemology, was taken from Schopenhauer's famous moral tract of a similar title. So we see that at one level, faith and reason are coming together. Morality and reason are coming together in a certain way. In that morality and moral attitudes, values, attitudes towards meaning are not only crucial but essential to these particular scientific insights and insights concerning scientific discovery. The discovery is not possible without these moral attitudes towards meaningfulness and what is meaning. So I'll just leave it on that note. And I think if I leave the viewer with a sense of the moral import or the moral importance, and even the theological importance, the idea that Popper, someone who on the surface of it was agnostic or even atheist, is perhaps creating the most impressive defense of not only of faith in the modern world, of meaning in the modern world, of opening room for theology, opening room for. I mean, he's the best friend of the theologian in that sense. He's opening room in the modern world for kind of a not only reconciliation but also opposition to crude and naive scientific views that oppose religion based on a narrow positivist view of science, scientific view of science, that religion isn't testable or empirically verifiable, so it's nonsense. So Popper's view that religion remains meaningful. It may not we can't reduce it to the same sort of methodological procedures associated with science, but nonetheless, not only is it crucial for human meaning, human development, it also plays a role in some sense um, in, in a background sense in our discoveries. And what are discoveries for individuals? For we all discover. It's not only the great scientists like Einstein who makes discoveries. We all individually make discoveries, and at the individual level, discovery is learning. Discovery is development. We all develop and we all learn. Thank you.